Welcome to Rethinking Communication. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we better connect with each other through the power of our words. For most of us, formal education left gaps in our ability to communicate well with each other, especially when trying to navigate conflict, inspire change, and overcome misunderstandings. I'm a former journalist, a speaking coach, and a communication expert, and my goal is to encourage you to rethink what it means to be an effective communicator, from the stage to the meeting room to the living room and everywhere in between. If you had to go a year where you were radically honest with people, that you told them the truth no matter what the circumstance, what the question, what the situation, could you do it? What about a year of daily kindness, where every day you committed to doing one kind act for someone else? Think about over the course of 365 days, all the different situations and all the different contexts that you would be in where radical honesty might be accepted or might be welcomed, and all the different situations where it might be unwarranted, perhaps, or even a little dangerous. What about kindness in those contexts where you don't want to be kind because the person across from you said something or did something where it didn't jive with who you are? My guest in this episode, John Wang, did both of those things. He spent a year practicing radical honesty and a year practicing daily kindness. Now, John is the author of the book Big Asian Energy, and he's a podcaster as well. And a lot of the work that he does focuses on communication through different cultural lenses and how coming from the East to the West or vice versa, putting yourself in the context of the culture that you're in, how your communication is affected by that is deeply important. And in fact, as John puts out there, most of our problems arise from how we communicate with ourselves and with other people. And a lot of times it happens to be, have we picked up on the right context? Have we picked up on the right situation that we're in? That could be cultural, but as you'll hear in this conversation, it could be a lot of other things as well. You made a post. I'm not even sure if you remember this, but you made a post on Instagram almost 5 years ago now that as I was doing my research for this conversation, it struck me and I want to read it because it sets up my first question. I'm not going to read the whole
Oh my
thing.
gosh. Wow. I've been on a lot of podcasts. I don't think anyone has referenced something from 5 years ago.
I believe it was actually December 20th, 2020, but who's counting?
Oh yeah. Now I'm excited.
No,
Jump in.
you wrote in this particular post, sometimes you just need to let people be wrong or to disagree with you. And you go on to say, you just have to decide which conversations are actually worth the effort.
Hmm.
And John, my question for you is, how do you determine which conversations, which relationships, what's worth the effort? How do you determine what's worth the effort there?
Hmm. The word that comes up for me is alignment. And what I mean by alignment is values. And every conversation, I this is a quote. I think I want to say it's like Eckhart Tolle or some teacher out there. Don't quote me on this one, but he said every time you're conversing with somebody, there should be two things you're thinking about. One is, am I being kind? And am I being truthful? And I like to think that really every moment we're having a conversation with somebody, we are revealing and connecting a part of who we are. And so much of our time, I can tell you right now, I've wasted years of my life trying to persuade people to see something in my direction that I look back now and I'm like, that wasn't even about them. I didn't even care whether or not they believed it. I just wanted to be heard because I felt unheard. And now I kind of go, well, is this really something that I care to change their mind on? Or is this, am I being kind? Am I being truthful in that? Or is this just about me? And since making that determination, I think my life has gotten a lot better. So, not as many arguments, not as many conflicts. Everyone is just easygoing. I'm like, great. Is this my hill? Nope. Great. And I'm moving on.
John, how'd you come to that realization that, hey, this is not worth the effort, or this isn't how I want to show up here? This change is more about me than them. How'd you make that determination?
Mm, so I grew up with, I would say, strong opinions in my family, which is another way of saying that, I grew up in a traditional Asian parenting structure, which is a nice way of saying that my parents had strong opinions about who I am and who I'm supposed to be. And, in in my household, communication styles were oftentimes really focused on top down, right? So if your parents say something, you kind of obey because that's what you're supposed to do as a good Asian kid. And so growing up, I think there was just a lot of opinions that I was just felt like were kind of repressed. I just want to get out there and be seen and be heard and be right all the time. Um, but at a certain point, I realized how often I was having conversations that didn't end up going anywhere, in the sense that I didn't feel like I was being heard and I wasn't really hearing the other person. And I started looking at it and going, well, what is my intention here and what am I getting out of this? Every word we are giving is a investment of our time and energy. So I want to make sure that they're going the right way. Am I trying to persuade or am I really seeking to understand?
Were you using, to use your words from earlier, were you out of alignment with your own parents?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I was. But I didn't know it. And I think that that was the thing, is to understand, am I in alignment with the person I'm talking to? What I'm talking about is really like, do we share the same value? In other words, if I'm having a conflict with somebody, if I'm having a fight, even with like my wife or somebody else, like if we're having a disagreement, the question is, are we all trying to get to the same result? And a common result might just be, because whenever we have two opposing ideas, in my belief system, there's always going to be two winners. When two people come together and they disagree, there should be always two winners, because either I come in and I share my idea, I share my perspective, and the other person says, yes, you're right. And now I've been validated. I'm like, great, I feel good. Or I'm going to learn, oh, wait, they have a different perspective that might be better than mine. And if that's the case, then I'm going to walk away with a better idea. So, technically speaking, every time we're in conflict, we should always have two winners. So, where does the real conflict come from? Well, my observation was that the real conflict came because we get too attached. We get so attached to the idea of being right, to our identity, that that's where we run into, I would say, more of a problematic dynamic. And that was a lot of my childhood.
John, I want to go there. What is it like for you? What was it like for you to
Mm,
grow up as you just described, kind of that
mhm,
stereotypical top down communication style in an Asian household, to now you're teaching others
mm,
who have lived similar experiences to break away from that, and often using your own experiences as a model and an example of that, of what that looks like.
mm.
I'm curious, what's the dynamic with your parents? What's the dynamic when you've outlined this thing and you're actively working against it, and yet it is a part of you, it is a part of who you are, it is a part of your background and your history? What's that like for you?
Hmm. I think there's a lot of different layers that I've learned to navigate over the years. In the early stages, what I really learned when I was growing up was self silencing. That the easiest way to shut down an argument from getting worse, from being yelled at, or whatever it is. Not to say that my parents were always yelling. In fact, now I have a great relationship with them, and I see the human being behind my parents, and I love them so much. They're such ridiculously kind and funny and charming, loving people. But at the time, I didn't realize that there was just a different, maybe style of communication, because
Okay.
I was growing up in the West, which is to say, very individualistic. There's a lot of teachings of like every voice matters and your thoughts matter. And my parents grew up in the East, where there was more of a cultural emphasis on, let's say, social hierarchy, right? Like there's this term called filial piety, which is that you must respect and obey your parents no matter what they say. And I think a big clash was that. So my way of dealing with the clash was just kind of to shut down a little bit and just to not communicate. I'd write essays in my heart while I was listening to all that, and I was having full blown arguments in the back of my head. But out front, you just kind of nod and go along with it. And unfortunately, what that taught me was the pattern that I then took on to be an adult, which is I started self silencing in places where I maybe shouldn't have been self silencing. That might have been at work, that had been in relationships. And it was just more passive and perhaps avoidant than it was really about engaging in real, deeper conversations, especially things that are in alignment.
You said you have a great relationship with your parents now. What was that moment of, or what was that process? I'm sure it wasn't just a moment, but what was that process like of finding the two winners there, of finding the value alignment? What did you both want that you could find that common ground in?
There was an actual moment,
Was
and it
there?
was
Okay. I
it was
shouldn't
an
assume.
it was a story. So there was a year in which I was going through my own, I would say, journey of discovery, because at a certain point I realized something wasn't right in my life. I felt like I wasn't being seen and heard in the way that I would like to be, in the ways that I was showing up with my friends and the people around me. So I got really into learning about how to speak better, how to be more confident, how to, show up with the people around me. And that might even look like, being a more assertive leader, or honestly, probably my early 20s, what I care more about was just getting more dates. So during this time, I encountered this book called Radical Honesty. It was by a psychologist who talks about how, in his views, almost all of our interpersonal problems are from the fact that we're not speaking our truth. And it was a crazy idea, but he talked about how he practices radical honesty, which is saying only the truest things that he could say. If he has a thought, he says it. And it was such a wild change from how I was raised, which was that we don't speak our truth. We hold back on the things that we really believe, either because we're trying to be nice or be kind, or because we're just trying to avoid conflict, kind of like I was doing back then. And I decided, what would it be like if I tried this for a year? It was a wild idea to say that, okay, I'm going to try this. So I took an oath of radical honesty for a year and say, I'm going to go and only speak the truth. And I wanted to see how it feel, because to me, that was really about breaking my own patterns of self-silencing so I could really show up and feel more confident. So I said, okay. And one of the first things that you had to do in the assignments of that was, you have to go to your parents and tell them every lie you can remember ever telling them. Now,
Oh boy.
that, yeah. If you're hearing this and going, wow, yeah. So for me, that was one of the hardest things. Not to say that I lied a lot to my parents, but there was just a lot that we just didn't talk about. We didn't talk about anything that was too unpleasant. And, there's just a lot of things that were just easier to keep from them. I thought I was being nice by not telling them the truth. So I had to sit down with them. And I basically had to go through and tell them, hey, mom, dad, there are some things I need to catch you up on. I'm doing this experiment. I'm telling the truth. And here's a list of all the lies I remember telling you. And that included everything from, oh, yeah, back when I was in, grade 9, I, like photocopied my report card and changed the grade, or I snuck out in the middle of the night, and those cigarettes you found were not actually belonging to my friend. They were actually mine. Um, and they, of course, they at first were just, they found it hilarious, because they were just like, yeah, we knew that. You dummy. Of course they were your friends. We knew that. But it actually opened up a lot more conversations. And what we started diving into and started sharing as these conversations started, it started with them feeling worried, of course, because, when your child comes to you and say, I'm going to tell the truth for the first time, you're going to worry. And then it went into understanding, And then they started telling me their truths, which is, I think, really for the first time that I started going and realizing, oh wow, like there's your human experience that was behind it that I wasn't seeing at the time. And when that channel started opening up, the more I started to share about how I really felt, about how well I was going through, the struggles I was going through, all the things that I hid from them, really was when we started to actually communicate for the first time, not just talk at each other, not just provide the basics of social interaction, but really connecting as humans. And I think that was a major point of change that led to much better relationships.
How else did that year change you? Because that's I mean, that moment there, yeah, that's massive, but how else are you showing up during that year? What is changing in relationships? What's different about how you're communicating with people in a year of radical honesty?
There were lots and lots of learning. What I learned about radical honesty at the time was that you very quickly find out who your friends are willing to put up with and stick around for, and who are your real friends. Not to say the ones who weren't my real friends. It was just that when I started sharing, hey, listen, I'm going through this thing. You can ask me any question you want. I'm bound by my promise to myself that I'm going to speak the truth. And that was the rule number one: is I wasn't allowed to tell a lie, down to the most embarrassing things. And it was just, my friends had a great time with that. You know, so if there was something they would, oh my gosh, like they would ask me about my past experiences, most embarrassing moments, all the little secrets that I had. And I'm like, all right, well, this is what it was. And it taught me really that my biggest fears of what other people would find out about me were not really that scary. And because after you start telling people what it is that you are concerned about, inviting people in and being that much more vulnerable, you start realizing, oh, people could hold the truth of who I am. And then this also invites them to share who they are. So a lot of times there was two outcomes that would happen. One group was I would chat with them and they would be like, "Oh, that's an interesting thing. Like, tell me about what you really think about me." And I would be like, "Okay, and this is just my opinion. These are all the things I love about you. These are all the things that kind of irk me sometimes. I really still love you, but that wasn't a match for me." And either one of two things would happen. Either they would then go, okay, well, I understand. And then we kind of stopped being friends for a while, at least until I was done the experiment. Or they'd come back and they'll be like, well, this is what I thought about you. And I'm like, great. Tell me what you really feel. And now it sounds conflicting, but the truth is that most of the time I'm like, oh yeah, I did have that habit. Oh, I was being annoying that day. Oh, sorry, I didn't realize that me flaking out on you was, creating so much problems. My gosh, I'm so sorry, and I could take responsibility. And we would talk until 3 o'clock in the morning. We would talk about everything. And at the end of it, it felt like we were much, much, much deeper friends. So I would probably say my friends split up into maybe half or maybe one third in that division. But it taught me a lot about how much I was holding back was really not about being nice or kind, which is what I thought it was about, or even considerate. It was just that I was trying to avoid conflict because I was afraid that my true thoughts wouldn't be accepted by other people.
John, first off, I can't believe you told your friends. Of course, they're going to take advantage of that information. Like you're doing a year of honesty. Let me pick at this. I have the movie Liar Liar running around in my head right now.
That was what part of the inspiration. Yeah.
but
That
but
was a
I'm
great movie. Oh.
yeah, it was. I love that movie. I'm curious that story that you tell yourself, that we tell ourselves, that if you really
Mm,
knew the me behind the niceties, the
mm,
front that we put up, you wouldn't love me, you wouldn't care for me, you wouldn't be my friend.
mhm,
I'm sensing that you felt this not only with your parents, but as you just explained, your friends as well, and others. From your experience, where does that story come from? Where does that story that we tell ourselves that if you knew the real me, you wouldn't love me or you wouldn't like me, where does that come
mm.
from?
Oh, oh, this goes deep. For me, I think it was learned in childhood. Um, there's a there's I think this is fairly universal, but I think that at some point, we all have some degree of performance that we put on for the people around us. And that's just something we learned as a, let's say, adaptive strategy. But what I found is that in my family and culture, because there's layers to what we are even allowed to show other people, because there's this concept in, I was born in Taipei, and in my culture, that there's a concept called face. And it's really important that we understand face, which is how it is that we're showing up other people. It's very important that we don't, accidentally offend people in those situations. So you really learn to hide your true feelings because the general belief is that your true feelings are messy and it's embarrassing for other people to hold or hear. As a matter of fact, if you are pouring your heart out to somebody who doesn't understand the nuances of that, who's from that background, their first impression might be, oh, for your sake, I'm just going to leave because it's so embarrassing for you to have to be witness in this, as opposed to, oh, I'm going to stay here and I'm going to hold space for you and listen and really communicate and support you through this. Very different cultural backgrounds. But I
Yeah.
think we all, to some degree, learned that there were certain things that we were allowed to say around certain people and certain things that we weren't. And we got very good at playing those different roles. We become like kind of like chameleons, right? We adapt ourselves to whatever environment it was. And for me, I think there was a deeper fear that I wasn't good enough as who I was. I wasn't accomplished enough, smart enough, successful enough, whatever it was, to truly be accepted. So I learned to be nice. I learned to put on a smile. I learned to put on that show. And this, I think, is my own personal experience. But I think for all of us, we have some degree or some element of a mask that we put on because we think that will help us become better accepted, better respected, even. And we just don't really question it after we become adults, and maybe we should.
I know this is what you specifically help people with, coming from one cultural background in the East to the West, and understanding the nuance there. But man, it seems like it's a universal experience. And is there anything culturally that I should know? For instance, I grew up in the United States in Midwestern Kansas, right? Is there anything I should know as folks are going through that change that can help in the way I communicate with them?
I think there are some so first of all, you're absolutely right. It is universal. We all experience elements of this. It's just how the culture around us is built.
Yeah.
So sociologists have identified that there are what we call collectivist cultures, which is usually what we refer to as Japan, China, Korea, etc., versus more individualistic cultures, which are more like the United States or Western Europe, etc. And in the collectivist cultures, there was a higher tendency for it to be what we call high context communication. And this is just all fancy ways of basically saying there is a higher pressure to read the room. And I'll give you an example of this is that, when I was going to Japan, I had a friend there and he was trying to explain to me what it was like to be in Japan. And he said, one of the things you might notice is that people here don't say no quite as often and they're less direct in what they're trying to tell you, as opposed to if you were in, let's say, New York. People have no problems telling you what they really feel about you. And it's because there's a cultural understanding that we're in a collective environment. This is a harmonious environment. And saying no might be too harsh. So we'll hint, we'll add mitigating language like, oh, maybe this is, maybe there are other options that we might consider that might be equally helpful to you. And that is like a blaring red no that somebody is bashing your head in with. But to somebody who is from, let's say, a low context communication culture where we just are very clear about this is what I need, this is what I think, and we can be polite about it, it might be confusing. So there is a difference in that degree, what we talk about in mitigating languages, in the degree of how direct are, especially feedback or negative feedback. Do we tell somebody, hey, this is could have been done better, go and change this? If you're in areas in Europe, that would have been perfectly accepted. And yet, if you are in other places in the world, that would be seen as a very significant breach of someone's face or someone's reputation. Perhaps it
Mhm.
was not at all okay. So it depends on the culture. I would say there's that cultural nuance, but beneath all of that, I do think, yes, who we really are, that is a universal part. We're all human beings at the end of the day.
John, you used the word polite, kind, nice several times here, and I believe you also did a year of daily kindness. Is that correct?
Oh, yeah. That's
Okay,
right. Yeah.
and you, I saw that you said that it taught you to stop being nice. So, year of daily kindness taught you to stop being nice. For
Hmm.
somebody listening who might ask the question, "What's the difference?" How do you explain it?
That's a great question. And again, good job on the research. So, kind versus nice is a difference between passivity and activity, I think. So, kindness has to be active, it comes from empathy and compassion and desire. And nice, on the other hand, is really about being passive. It's just holding back and being non confrontational, not triggering anyone else's, let's say, aggression, not accidentally offending other people. I think the issue between nice and kind is that nice usually comes from a desire to avoid conflict or even a manipulation. And I'm using that word, and I realize that it's a big word and sometimes could be a little triggering for people. But what I mean by that is that there's this idea of an unspoken contract that we go through. And the idea is that if I'm nice enough to you, if I'm doing things for you, then at one point you'll either give me love or acceptance or attention or even do me favors. Kind, on the other hand, is only one directional. It is, I am doing something for you because it comes from a place of a glad heart. I am going to give to you because it makes me happy to do something kind for you. And to me, when I started that experiment, it was because I was at the time I was backpacking to Nepal, and I got lost because I was a terrible planner and I did not think ahead about where I was going to be for one of the excursions I was doing, and I got stranded in the middle of the road. And it was starting to be, night was coming, and I was far away from my hotel, and there was this, little, I would say, like a small van that pulled up, and a local Nepalese family basically invited me in. And I said, "Oh, thank you." And I hopped in the car, and he took me. And along the drive, we started chatting. And I found out, even though his English wasn't the most communicative, that he was actually going the opposite direction from where he was already going. So, of course, I felt really bad about this because it was him and his family and his wife and his kids were there. So I was just like, okay, well, you got to let me pay you. At least you got to let me take your family out for dinner. And he turned it all down. And the end of it, I kept trying to offer. I was literally looking through my bag and be like, "What can I give you right now that you'll accept?" And he kind of looked at me, and he, in the best of his abilities, he basically said, "I do for me, not for you." As in,
Mm.
the kindness is coming from me. The kindness itself is for ourselves. And that's how I reframed, I think, how those interactions are. Because I think for a long time, I was being nice because I wouldn't even say really being polite. I just didn't want to make anyone mad at me. And that really wasn't about the true connection of really genuinely giving, because there's always a little bit of a hook attached to that. So that was when, the experiment started. I said, well, what if I did? And it was the same thing. I was like, it's always started the same thing. I love these. Every year I pick an experiment for myself, and I just like go and try it. So it started with about a month, and I said, what happens if I could do an act of kindness every single day for a month? And it was one of the greatest things I ever done. I became so much happier. I didn't realize how much science there are behind acts of kindness, but it was incredible how much happier I felt at the result of it. And I went, this is the difference. Kindness is not niceness. And I think, in fact, we should just be more kind, not more nice.
What's the thing that you did that was the most kind that stuck out to you?
Ooh, oh wow. Okay, that's a question I've never been asked. Hmm. I was okay. This is probably one of the deepest moments, but the funniest thing about this was that it's not really my kindness. Is it okay if I share that one?
Of course.
It
Go
was
ahead.
it was one of those things. Okay, so I was part of the little group. We just all got together and we're just like, let's go do kind things for fun. Like, what would that look like? So we would meet every week and we will like pick something. And that week, somebody had the idea of saying, let's go to this area. It's called the downtown east side in Vancouver. You know, it's kind of like the Skid Row of our city. And let's give away socks and gloves and scarves to people, because a lot of people don't realize that these are actually much more important for the unhoused or the homeless population. And so we're like, okay, great. And in our group, there were mostly adults, but somebody decided to bring a few kids, like their nieces and nephews with them. Two kids, adorable. And they came along with us as a teaching moment. And we went around the downtown east side and we gave away, you know, socks and we gave away scarves and food. And people were all so grateful. People came up and say thank you, etc. And then at one point, we came across this woman who was pushing a little cart, and clearly she was, you know, struggling. And same thing, we went up to her and we said, hi, we're giving away, you know, some clothing, would you like some? And she smiled and she thanked us. And we, you know, you know, what would you like? Here's some socks, here's some gloves. And she took it and she accepted them. She said thanks. And at the time, she had a little baggie of sour candies that were in front of her, and they were open bag, you know those Maynards, Sour Patch Kids,
Yeah.
that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
she had it in front of her, and she saw the kids, and she turned around, and she just very instinctively went, "Hey, would you like some?" And of course, all the adults standing around, we're all going, "Uh oh, is this safe? Like, this is clearly a rough neighborhood. Is this okay?" But kids being kids, they didn't think about that. They just reached over, said thank you, and just go, thank you, and then grabbed it and popped it in their mouth. And of course, collectively, we were just like, like, it, what can we, is this okay? And what was so magical happened next, because she the lady then turned to the kids and said, thank you for accepting. And she said, I have been out here on the street, and for the last 2 months, every day I always have this candy, and I always try to offer it to people because I just want to see if anybody else wanted some, and nobody ever said yes until you.
Hmm.
And even compared to the time where she was accepting the socks and the gloves and everything like that, her smile felt so real and so warm, because I think that for that moment she got to give, and giving is when we truly connect to our humanity. And that was probably the single most, I think, breathtaking moment of what I saw kindness was that the two kids accepting that candy was actually the gesture of kindness that she really needed. It wasn't about us adults trying to
Hmm.
give her something. So to me, that would be the story of, I think, what was the greatest kindness.
I want to underscore that the point that you've made throughout this, that story and your explanation earlier. What is it important for us to understand in that kindness is actually our act for us rather than the juxtaposed against the nicety of trying to mitigate or placate the other? What is important
Hmm.
for us to understand about why it's important that it's an act for us?
Hmm. I think the basis of this is that whenever we're thinking of communication, we tend to think about it as, at least in my view, it's very transactional. As in, I'm delivering information, I'm receiving information. And when you take a look at that moment of kindness that was there, that would have seemed transactional. Most of the time, we're giving somebody something because it's something we want. Like, we are experiencing something as a trait, even if the trait is just within ourselves. I think those moments of true connection that truly happen comes from a place where we release that expectation of transaction, and we are truly communicating human to human, heart to heart. And even though that was candy being transacted, not words or ideas, at the core of it, it is unadulterated by intention. It was just pure. And this is, I think, if we're coming and talking about rethinking communication, I think at the core of this is, if we're being truly kind to both ourselves and the other person, then we are also allowing ourselves to have the full authenticity of our experience, even including the imperfections and the messiness and the uncertainties and all of that. And I
Hmm.
think that's where we are at our best.
So maybe a little bit of a leading question here, but you've talked about you've talked about the avoidance of conflict, the self-silencing. Can you
Mm.
show up? How do you show up with kindness in conflict? If it
Mm.
is bringing our full authenticity, if it is, as you just explained, bringing that moment of kindness for ourselves and for others, what happens when we
Mhm.
really don't feel like it, John, because this person
Mm.
just said something that I don't like. We're now in
Mhm.
disagreement, we're now in conflict. I feel morally obligated to, as you referenced earlier, change this person, make them see that
Mm.
I'm right, they're
Mhm.
wrong. How does kindness show up in that space?
Oof, that's a great question. Um, let's take the most extreme example. Let's take I'm talking to somebody who is truly, let's say, racist or somebody who has a belief so extreme that I'm just like, oof, there's an anger there. And the way that they're communicating, and I've sat through some situations like with like that. I've been called names. I've been times like that. And what I actually teach and what I support people doing is actually assertive and saying, don't let be silenced. Don't just run away from a situation. Stand there, stand in your power, own what that experience is, and communicate from that space. Where kindness shows up for me is the compassion of the human being behind it. If somebody is coming at me with anger, it's because there's hurt behind it.
Hmm.
And now, most of the time, our reaction to somebody coming at us with anger is we take it personally, right? If somebody's coming at us with an attack, we go, "Oh man!" and we pick up our swords, we pick up our, our shields, and we start going at it, and we get ready for war. And my take is, well, if you're coming at me, what is the pain within you that makes you hold this belief that you need to feel like you're superior to me? At what point were you not seen? At what point were you struggling? And now I don't have to just go into therapy mode and be like, let's talk about your childhood. But I can hold that understanding and say, wow, yeah, there's a lot of anger there. Wow, I see that you're going through something. And I could hold that humanity if somebody is coming at me and I'll be like, well, I could see that there's a lot of frustration underneath that. But, I'm going to talk about the thing that you said. And the usually I like to start with is just asking that question, which is like, when you said that, did you mean this?
Mhm.
And what I mean by that is that if you're in a conversation and somebody says something that was hurtful, that was mean spirited, that might have been trying to dig in at you, sometimes I'll just take a moment and I'll just repeat it back to them. I'll just like, did you mean that? Like, did you mean to say this about me? Did you mean this message? And a lot of times, people, when they hear what they said back to them, now they're on the point where they go, did I mean that? And most of the time, people actually will back off and even apologize with me. Just say, I'm so sorry. No, I was just mad because you said this. And I was like, I understand that. And then we could both take responsibility for whatever it is we said. But we want to take a moment and say, is this true? Was your intention? Because I think intention and words have to be separated for us to understand, right? The intention behind
Mm.
somebody could be innocent or it could be mean spirited, but we want to make sure we separate those and we can identify those. Otherwise, we're almost always arguing about intention when really we should be arguing about is how the message landed.
Oh boy. We could talk for a long time about that, John.
That's a big topic. Yeah, for sure. Should
But
we schedule a second episode?
I want to if you could repeat that. I want to underscore what you just said, and I believe I have it right. So let me paraphrase it back to you, and you tell me if I've got it
Mhm.
right. We are often in conflict, arguing about the intention and the intention that we felt rather than the words. Am I getting that
Mhm.
correct?
Yes, absolutely. Or the message. Because we tend to, even, in relationships, I see this within in relationships so much. There is what is being spoken, and then there is the meta message.
Yeah.
The meta message is the need. So, like, why don't you ever, I'm going to use the cliche, right?
Go
Why
ahead.
don't you
Yeah.
put down the toilet seat? Is not actually why don't you put down the toilet seat? It's I have been working all day And I am coming home. I am working so hard to be here for this family and nobody considers me. Why do you not consider me enough to put down the toilet seat? And the other person listening might be, why do I have to put up the toilet seat? Maybe you got to put down the toilet seat yourself. But that message might carry a meta message of, every day when I was growing up, my parents would yell at me for not putting my shoes in the right place, not doing the right things. And I'm so tired of people trying to control my actions and not taking responsibility for them. I love you. Why can't you see that? And if you understood this, then you wouldn't worry about some dumb toilet seat. But that's not what's being said. So the two people could go back and forth, and we are smart, right? Like we're so good at coming up with reasoning. I could go into my phone and being like, toilet seats were invented to be put down. Like we could find all the justifications, but then it misses the intention. And the intention could have just been like, why didn't you hear me? And why are you trying to control me? But if we actually spoke to those parts, it is way easier to get to the resolution.
Man. You talk about helping people become a communication ace, and ACE is an acronym.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to just explain what that acronym ACE means, ACE. You've
Mhm.
referenced assertive already. Uh,
Mhm.
do people and I'll start this. Do people misunderstand what being assertive actually is from your
Yes.
experience?
All the time. Absolutely. When I use the word assertive, people tend to think there's a there's an imagery, right? It's usually like somebody who is, you know, powerful looking, strong, uh, usually male, who is kind of like demanding other people to listen to them.
Yeah.
And they tend to confuse assertive with aggressive.
Mhm.
And then this is where it is that I think a lot of people go, I'm not really comfortable with that. I don't, I know I should be more confident, but I just don't see myself as that person. I'm a simple person. I'm usually pretty quiet. I'm fine with who I am. Why do I have to change myself? And I point out that there's such a thing as quiet and, even soft versus strong assertiveness. And you could be assertive and say very little. Assertiveness could literally be just a pause. Using the example we're talking about before, it could literally just be a pause and a question of saying, what did you mean by that? Or it could be, "Hmm, that doesn't land for me. Let's not bring that again." Or just, I, I'm not interested in talking about this anymore. I feel complete. And something as quiet and as simple as that is very powerful and assertive because you're simply asserting what your needs are. And the ACE framework that I talk about is a mapping of the three main ways that I've witnessed people and how they lead in relationships. Because there's every relationship, every conversation, there's always a leading and a following. And when I say this, I don't mean that one person is always leading. You'll see it kind of go back and forth.
Yeah.
Usually, when I was studying acting all the way back when I was in college, that was one thing they would say is that you would take a look at two people in a scene, and there's always one person who holds more power in that dynamic. And if we took a look at leadership, that's essentially what it is who is leading the frame of communication that you're currently conversing on. And we usually lead through one of three ways. Assertiveness is simply expressing our ideas and our thoughts and asking them to be heard and held. Competence is a little bit different. So C, the ACE, the C stands for competence. So competence is usually when we lead not from just being direct with what we want, but through our strengths and capabilities, our experiences and knowledge. So that tends to be the second one. And then E stands for empathy, which is when we lead first from seeing the other person and hearing the other person, that warmth. And this system that we essentially built was essentially built on the stereotype content model that was developed by a group of psychologists that took a look at how we show up with everybody else. And they really found that most of the time when we show up with other people, we're always being seen through only two metrics. The first one is called competence, which is what we're talking about. How competent is this person? Where are they on the social ladder? How successful are they? And the second one is warmth. And warmth is essentially empathy. How warm do we recognize this person to be? Somebody who is high competence and high warmth, we look at them and we go, that's who I want to follow. That's the person I like. I respect them. and I trust them. Somebody who's low on the warm side but high on the competence side, we go, well, I admire the guy, but I don't really feel that close to them. I don't really
Mhm.
feel like I'm seen around them. And then somebody who is high only on empathy and warmth and not on competence, we go, they're likable. They're like the nice lady on the bus that you chat with, and I'm like, oh, you're so sweet. I really like you, but would I take your advice when it comes to my taxes? Maybe not. And we all have a leadership style or communication style that, in my experience, leads from one of those three things. The question is just, are we in balance with all three?
As we begin to wrap up here a little bit, I want to go back to taking what you just said, the assertive, the competent, the empathetic. Something that struck me, John, is the the things you talk about, the experiences that you've gone through in trying to be more direct, trying to be more kind, that year of radical honesty,
Mm,
it tends to, at least in my mind, line up with the more low context communication style of the West.
mhm.
And do people ever get into this? I don't think what you're saying is one is better than the other, but do do people get caught up in that? Like, "Oh, I need to be more like how we speak in the United States or Western Europe versus the high text, I've gotta always be reading the room conversation that you talked about, or the face," right?
Mm.
Do people get caught up in one being right, wrong, good, bad?
It's a really good question. So I created the framework specifically because I realized that for a long time in my life, I just always thought I needed to be more westernized. I needed to be much more aggressive. I needed to, puff my chest and be dominant and always be self out, self promoting and all these things that tends to be more acceptable in that Western sphere. Because I'm a children of immigrant. I'm a child of immigrants, right? I
Yeah,
live between the two cultures. And the reason why I wanted to create an A system was because I realized there is actually a way for both to purely coexist. How can we take the best of both communication styles and meet in the middle? So, as I was saying, assertive is not aggressive. Empathy is not always having to be vulnerable and open with yourself all the time. It's just about acknowledging and referencing and seeing that. And because I think that at the end of the day, communication is such a contextual thing. Every person we're talking to has their own internal calibration. Every social context we're in, if we're at work, if we're at a meeting, if we're with our friends at the bar, if we're somewhere else, if we're at home with our family, our conversation and communication styles will have its own cultural differences. But the only question is there times that we feel like we are hiding elements of who we are because that was an adaptive pattern that we learned at some point? And that's the only thing that I care about. How do we show up more authentically us and communicate powerfully, confidently, comfortably, um, smoothly, harmoniously without having to hide those elements of who we are? Does that answer your question?
I think so. And for you, John, how has that played itself out in your life? In you describing your relationship with your parents? I believe at one point you said everything went wrong for me when my mother decided to start publishing child education books.
Yeah. Yeah.
How has what you just described, that understanding of the duality of the communication styles that we live in, how has that played out for you? And what do you hope people take away from your example and your experience?
Hmm. I think that the core element is that there is no wrong way of being you, but there is times where we hide who our true selves are because we think it'll make us safer. So the question just comes to, okay, I'm gonna use my parents' situation because yeah, my mom. So my mom was a child education expert who wrote books about us when we were growing up,
You were
and
doomed. You were doomed from the start.
oh man, I had no chance. Yeah, yeah. I mean, imagine being 10 years old and reading a book about yourself with a baby picture on the cover. Yeah, there's just no way to live
It's a
to
trip.
live that down.
It's a trip.
Um, it's a trip for sure. I think that really it comes down to 2 layers. One is it took me a long time to get to a point where I've come to accept myself fully. And I think that's always the hardest thing, really, because other people can't see who we really are until we're willing to see who we are ourselves. And that was my own journey of saying, what was it that I truly believe? What is it? We started this conversation talking about values and alignment, but I wasn't in alignment with my own values. I was living a life based on what it is that my society, the people around me, my parents wanted me to be. And for most of my life, I was chasing that view. And it took me going through burnout and crashing and healing before I realized, oh, actually, those are not my values. And then when I can embrace those values, then when I go into the conversation with them again, I could come and just be like, well, this is who I am now. And and with my parents and with certainly with, people around, that oftentimes comes with you might not, this might not be what you expect. This might not be what you agree with. But I'm willing to bet that there's something underneath that we can find agreement on. I think that's more important. Let's go and explore and see what that is.
I read recently that you wrote most of our problems arise from how we communicate with ourselves and with others. And it sounds like, if I'm reading into your words there, it sounds like that work has to start with yourself before we outreach to others. How does someone do that, John? How does someone begin that work of changing the way we communicate with ourselves?
Hmm. We, for the most part, are not really aware that we have multiple parts, essentially.
Hmm.
And what I mean by that is that who we really are is the observer self. This is about to get a little bit more spiritual almost, but or
Go ahead.
psycho spiritual. But essentially, what we're talking about is, do we notice how we speak to ourselves? Do you ever slow down and actually write out and like listen to certain things throughout the day, little moments, something happens? For me, for a while, there was a lot of little judgments. I would see an opportunity and I would go, who are you to go and ask for that? You're not good enough. You're not smart enough. And I just kind of accepted that that was just my own beliefs of myself. And it wasn't until later on that I was, I think, having a conversation with a therapist and we're diving into these kind of topics that, she pointed out the way that we talk ourselves, wait, sorry, the way that we talk to ourselves um, is a learned practice. As in, the voice that we speak to ourselves in our head was a voice that somebody else taught us to speak. And those are the perspectives, the ideas, and our own grading systems. So the way that we talk to ourselves is the first and most important relationship that we'll ever have. And for me, that came out from journaling. And sometimes that we have, journal prompts that we offer people in the book that's coming out. We have it on websites and stuff. And really, the main thing is, things like could be let's take money for example, because that's always a conflicted one. My mother's beliefs about money were my beliefs about money were my mother's beliefs around conflicts were my beliefs around conflicts were. And this sounds very internal. It's because it is meant to be. And this is where we start to identify the difference between where we picked up those voices and what our true voice is.
Where's the difference? Where's the line that we draw between that learned voice
Mhm.
and the voice that we sometimes need to self-correct poor judgment, bad behavior, whatever, however you want to label it. Like if I say to myself, you know what, I really shouldn't have done that, and I screwed up there. Uh, that was unacceptable behavior, perhaps. Where's
Mhm.
the line that we draw between the the type of language and communication that you just described and the helpful self correction of our own internal dialogue? Does that question make sense?
Absolutely. So let's take that as an example. Let's say that, yeah, I walk out of a meeting or a conversation, and I, I said something that was a little bit of faux pas, and in my mind immediately goes into, oh my god, I can't believe I said that. Everyone thinks you're a loser. What were you thinking?
But
Like,
but but
oh
also, if I might interrupt, you might come out of that and say that what I said, yeah, I might have got a little heated, but that person deserved it. That I put them in their place, and I maybe shouldn't have used those words, but man, that was what needed to happen.
yeah,
We excuse ourselves with our own self language too, don't we?
we sure do. Yeah.
And
That's a really good
yeah, and
point.
I'm
Yeah,
wondering like
sometimes we let
where's
off ourselves the yeah, what if we let ourselves off the hook a little bit too easily?
yeah,
It's a
yeah.
valid point. Yeah, and I do think that sometimes this self-love movement that we have kind of got maybe misinterpreted along the way to think that we should just be in love with everything we do. We have
Yeah.
no faults. We just got to self-accept. And personally, I don't think that's the most helpful mindset, because I do think that there is a truth, and we have that internal compass of our value system of what is and isn't acceptable. And I've always liked the question of, is it true? Because that's always what it is
Mm,
in that moment that person deserved it. Is that true? What made it that they deserved it? And was what I said really coming from a place of justice or wanting to create pain because I was mad?
mhm.
And that does take a little bit more work around our self awareness and a willingness to take, I would say, responsibility and ownership
Yeah,
of our actions.
yeah.
And I think that's the part that maybe, on a social level, we could learn more about, that sometimes taking responsibility and ownership of things that we do, especially if it's impacted somebody else in a harmful way, and we know that, we see that in the moment, we could see when we created pain. We know in our body when we said something out of anger and there was a desire to dig in the knife.
Yeah.
And when we're able to catch ourselves doing that and ask, "Ooh, why?" and own that, we could address the behavior without making it a moral identity. And what I mean by that is that there's a difference between guilt and shame, right?
Mhm.
So, one thing is, did I do something wrong or am I something wrong? For people who are so attached to what I do as a judgment is who I am, it's hard for them to take ownership of their actions because they can never face it. They
Yeah.
can't just face, oh, I was just so mad. Oh, I shouldn't have said that, but I should probably go take ownership of that, because they go, oh, I can't accept that because otherwise I am a bad person. So it takes work. It takes a little bit of work, awareness, and ownership. I think that really comes from that part.
But I love that you brought it back to just those two simple questions that you mentioned earlier. Is it kind and is it true? And I think if we just
Mhm,
genuinely ask ourselves those questions, we
mhm,
begin that communication with ourselves from a healthier place. So I appreciate
mhm.
you putting it in that context, John. I've got one more question for you that I ask of all my guests, but before I ask it, just how can people connect with you? I know you've got a podcast, you've got a book out now. Just explain where people can find you and learn more about the work that you do.
Yeah, I love talking about things that excite me, ideas, things that I teach. So I post a lot of content on social media. I'm on TikTok under John Wang Bay, BAE, standing for Big Asian Energy, and I'm on Instagram as John Wang Official. Or if you want to check out the book, it's called Big Asian Energy, or go to the website bigasianenergy.com. The book comes out May 27th, and yeah, you could get it anywhere you could find books.
Perfect. We all know where those are, but I will link
Yeah.
them up in the show notes so people have one click access to it. And John, man, I appreciate it. My last question for you here is what's a question you wish you were asked more?
I feel that one. If I Okay, so this is a prompt that I love sharing when I do group exercises. And it goes, if I really knew you, what would I know about you? And then I'll ask a follow up prompt for people to ask each other, which is, if I really, really knew you, what would I know about you? I think for most of us, our communications are so functional that we don't really take time to try to understand that layer underneath. And this ties up to everything we're talking about: the intention, the kindness, the human being, the true expression of who we are always comes from that. And our desire to see other people gives them the opening for us to be seen as well.
John, I'm gonna put a deposit in the trust bank account here and ask you that question. If I really, really knew you, John, what would I know about you?
Whew, okay, let's dive deep. Okay, so I will share something very present in me in the last few days. I didn't really, I didn't really know that I had ADHD,
Hmm.
and I was given a diagnosis that I had ADHD when I was in college. And then I promptly thought ADHD is silly. That's not a real thing. Because I was just afraid of carrying that label. And I didn't want to carry that label. So I think I had a lot of personal rejection around that until a few days ago. So this is very live for me. But if you really, really knew me, you would know that I struggle with focusing and I am constantly all the places at once because I have ADHD. And that's just something about me.
Well, man, I appreciate the level of focus that you brought to this conversation. It's been wonderful. You've been great in answering my windy questions here and there.
No,
So
that was great.
thank you so much, John. I appreciate it, and best wishes to you. Let's stay in touch, okay?
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode of Rethinking Communication. If you enjoyed this episode, please do me a huge favor. Share this episode with someone in your network, someone who might find some value in the things that John and I spoke about in the course of our conversation here. And you'd be doing me a huge favor, so I appreciate it. If you want to learn more about my communications coaching, whether as a speaking coach or a leadership communications coach, please go to my website, michaelashford.com. The link is in the show notes, and check out everything listed underneath the coaching tab in the navigation. And let's talk. Let's talk if it's for your company, if it's for an event that you have, or if you just want one-on-one coaching on how to improve your communications. I'm here for you. I'd love to connect. You can also always email me at michael@rethinkingcommunication.com. That's it for this episode. Until next time, keep asking questions.